Sometimes the bravest acts happen in silence, witnessed only by the cold Montana wind and the snow. Sometimes heroes wear thin plaid blankets and frostbitten hands, not shining badges. After a brutal blizzard, rancher Jackson Miller hears wolves howling near his old hunting tower. He rides through the deep snow and finds two widows, nearly frozen, surrounded by starving wolves. Everyone thought they'd left for winter. When he rescues them, they explain why they were there. A medicine wagon had crashed nearby. The horses would draw the deadly wolf pack. So these women cut their hands and led the wolves away, sacrificing themselves so the entire town could survive. But why would they die for people who'd forgotten them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had finally stopped. That was the first thing Jackson Frost Miller noticed when he stepped onto the porch of his cabin that morning. 3 days of howling blizzard had ceased sometime during the night, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world had held its breath. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink that would have stolen Margaret's breath away. But Margaret had been gone 3 years now, 3 winters without her laughter warming the cabin, 3 springs without her garden, 3 summers without her humming while she canned vegetables, 3 autumns without her hand in his while they watched the aspens turn gold. Jackson pulled his coat tighter and stepped off the porch into snow that came up past his knees. He was 58 years old, though the Montana winters had aged him beyond that. His face was weathered like old leather, deeply lined around the eyes from years of squinting against the sun and wind. His hair, once dark as coal, had gone mostly silver, which was how he'd earned the nickname Frost from the folks in Clearwater Valley. The nickname had other meanings too. Some said it was because of the way he'd frozen up after Margaret died, pulling away from the community that had once been like family. Others said it was because his demeanor had grown cold, distant. Both were probably true. He made his way to the barn, his boots crunching through the crystalline surface of the snow. The horses nickered when they heard him coming. Buck, his old roan gelding, thrust his head over the stall door and snorted, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I know, boy," Jackson said, running his hand along the horse's nose. "You're ready to get out of here." He fed the horses first, then the few chickens that had survived the winter so far. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. This was his life. Now the simple rhythms of survival, the daily maintenance of a homestead that had been in the Miller family for 40 years. His father had built this place from nothing, howled every log, drove every nail. Jackson could still remember being a boy, maybe 7 or 8, watching his father work. The old man never complained, never faltered. He just did what needed doing, day after day, until the cabin stood solid and the barn was full. Jackson reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass compass his father had given him on his 18th birthday. It was worn smooth from decades of handling, the engraving barely visible now but burned into Jackson's memory. True north isn't on the map. His father had explained it to him once, sitting on this very porch on a summer evening much like any other. "A compass points to magnetic north," he'd said. "But true north, that's something different. That's about knowing who you are and what you stand for, even when the world's spinning around you." Especially then. Jackson had tried to live by those words. He'd tried to be the kind of man his father had been: steady, reliable, true. But after Margaret died, he'd lost his bearings. The compass still pointed north, but he wasn't sure he did anymore. He slipped it back into his pocket and finished his chores. The sun was higher now, bright enough to make him squint. The temperature had risen to maybe 10 degrees, which felt almost warm after 3 days of sub-zero cold. It was a good day to check the fence lines on the north property, make sure the storm hadn't brought down any posts or wire. Clearwater Valley stretched out below his homestead, a long sweep of white broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the creek. 5 miles downstream sat the town of Clearwater itself, maybe 200 souls all told. Good people, mostly. Ranchers and farmers, a few shopkeepers, the doctor, the minister, people who looked after each other when times got hard. People who had looked after him when Margaret died. They'd brought food for weeks. The women had cleaned the cabin, washed clothes, tried to help. The men had kept his livestock fed, mended fences, done the work he couldn't face. He'd appreciated it, truly, but he'd also resented it in a way he couldn't quite explain. Every act of kindness had felt like a reminder of what he'd lost. So he'd withdrawn, politely but firmly. He still went to town for supplies once a month, still nodded and spoke when spoken to, but he didn't linger, didn't accept dinner invitations, didn't let anyone get close. It was easier that way. Lonelier, but easier. Jackson saddled Buck and swung himself up. The horse seemed as eager as he was to stretch his legs after 3 days trapped in the barn. They set out north, following the fence line that marked the boundary of his property. The snow was deep but not impassable. Buck plowed through it with the patient determination of an old horse who'd seen plenty of Montana winters. Jackson let his mind drift as they rode, taking in the vast white silence of the landscape. This was when he felt closest to peace, out here alone with the horse and the mountains and the endless sky. They'd been riding for maybe an hour when Jackson first heard the wolves. The sound came from the north, from the direction of his old hunting tower. It was a sound he knew well, one that made his spine straighten and his hand move instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. The deep, resonant howling of timber wolves on the hunt. The ghost pack. That's what people in the valley called them. A dozen or more massive timber wolves that roamed the high country, particularly brutal in winter when game was scarce. They were smart, coordinated, and utterly ruthless. Jackson had lost 2 calves to them last spring, and old Tom Henderson had lost a horse. But this howling was different. It wasn't the ranging call of wolves on the move. It was the focused, frenzied sound of a pack that had prey cornered. Jackson urged Buck forward, moving faster now through the deep snow. The hunting tower was maybe a mile ahead, an old wooden structure he'd built 15 years ago near the property line. He hadn't used it in years, not since his knees had started objecting to climbing the ladder. The howling grew louder as they approached, mixed now with snarling and the snap of jaws. Buck's ears lay flat against his head, and Jackson could feel the horse's reluctance. He didn't blame him. No horse liked the sound of wolves. They crested a small rise, and Jackson saw the tower ahead. What he saw made him pull Buck to a sudden stop. The wolves were there. All of them. It looked like a dozen massive grey and black shapes circling the base of the tower. They were leaping up against the wooden support posts, snarling and snapping at something above. And on top of the tower, maybe 15 feet off the ground, were 2 human figures. They were wrapped in what looked like thin plaid blankets, huddled together against the cold. Even from this distance, Jackson could see they weren't moving much. The snow around the base of the tower was trampled and bloody, and the wolves were in a frenzy. Jackson's mind raced. Who would be out here? Everyone in the valley knew the ghost pack hunted this area. Anyone with sense would have headed south before the blizzard, or at least stayed close to town. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard and fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed across the snow, and the wolves scattered, backing away from the tower. But they didn't run far. They circled at a distance, watching him with yellow eyes, calculating. Jackson fired again, lower this time, kicking up snow near the closest wolf. That got them moving. The pack began to drift away, reluctant but wary of the gun. The alpha, a massive black wolf with a grizzled muzzle, gave one last look before leading the others toward the tree line. Jackson kept his rifle ready as he rode to the tower. Now that he was closer, he could see how bad things were. The figures on top were women, he realized. Their faces were visible above the blankets, pale and waxy in a way that made his stomach drop. They were still alive, he could see shallow breaths, but barely. "Can you hear me?" he called up, "Can you climb down?" No response. Neither woman moved. Jackson dismounted and studied the tower. The ladder was still intact, but it was icy and treacherous, and even if they could hear him, he doubted either woman had the strength to climb down safely. He was going to have to go up. The wolves had withdrawn to the tree line but were still watching. Jackson could feel their eyes on his back as he tested the first rung of the ladder. The wood was solid beneath his gloves, frozen but not rotten. He began to climb, rifle slung across his back, moving carefully on the icy rungs. The wind picked up as he climbed higher, and he could feel the tower swaying slightly. When he reached the top platform, he got his first clear look at the two women. He recognized them immediately, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow. Emma Hartley and Ruth Brennan, two widows from Clearwater Valley. He'd known both their husbands, good men who died too young, one from fever and one from a logging accident. That had been 2, maybe 3 years ago. He'd heard they were struggling, that the town had been helping them out. He'd even considered riding down to check on them himself, but he never had. And now, here they were, nearly frozen to death on his property. Emma was the younger of the two, maybe 45, with dark hair streaked with grey. Ruth was older, perhaps 55, her face deeply lined. Both women's hands were visible above the blankets, and Jackson's breath caught when he saw them. Their fingers were dark with frostbite, and their palms were cut, deliberately it looked like, with wounds that had bled and frozen. "Emma," he said, touching her shoulder gently. "Ruth, can you hear me?" Emma's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Her lips were blue, her face the color of old snow. "Ruth," Jackson tried again, louder this time. Ruth's eyes opened more fully. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to place his face. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm getting you down," Jackson said. "Both of you. Can you move your arms?" Ruth tried, managed a small movement. Emma didn't respond at all. Jackson assessed the situation quickly. He couldn't carry them both down the ladder, and the tower wasn't designed for this kind of rescue. He needed rope, needed help. But first, he needed to get them warm enough to survive the trip back to his cabin. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around Emma, then took Ruth's blanket and doubled it around her. It wasn't much, but it might buy them time. "I'm going down to get rope," he told Ruth. "I'll be right back." "Hold on." He climbed down faster than was safe, his mind already working through the logistics. The rope was in Buck's saddlebag. He'd have to rig some kind of sling, lower them one at a time, all while hoping the wolves didn't decide to come back. Jackson worked quickly, his fingers clumsy in the cold despite his gloves. He fashioned a rope sling and climbed back up to Ruth. First she was conscious enough to help, at least a little. He got the rope under her arms and tied it securely. "This is going to be rough," he told her, "but I've got you." Getting Ruth down was terrifying. She was dead weight for most of it, her frozen hands unable to grip the rope. Jackson had to lower her slowly, fighting to control the descent while his own hands burned from the friction. When she finally reached the ground, he practically fell down the ladder after her. Emma was worse. She hadn't regained consciousness, and Jackson had to maneuver her completely limp body into the sling. Every second he spent up there felt like tempting fate. The wolves were still watching from the trees, and the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. When Emma finally lay in the snow beside Ruth, Jackson allowed himself one moment to breathe. Then he moved into action. He got Emma across Buck's back first, then Ruth behind the saddle. It would be slow going, but the horse was strong, and the cabin was maybe 2 miles away. He'd walk and lead Buck, keep watch for the wolves. The journey back was one of the longest of Jackson's life. Every few minutes he'd check to make sure both women were still breathing. Emma remained unconscious, draped over the horse like a sack of grain. Ruth drifted in and out, sometimes mumbling words he couldn't make out. The sun was sinking fast, the temperature dropping with it. Jackson's hands ached from the cold and the rope burns. His legs burned from breaking trail through the deep snow. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because stopping wasn't an option. When the cabin finally came into view, relief flooded through him so strongly it almost buckled his knees. He led Buck right up to the porch steps and worked quickly to get the women inside. Emma first, carried in his arms like a child. Then Ruth, who was at least conscious enough to lean on him as he helped her through the door. The cabin was cold, the fire had gone out while he was gone. Jackson laid both women on the floor near the fireplace and got to work building up the fire as fast as he could. His hands shook as he struck the match, but the kindling caught and the flames began to spread. Only when the fire was roaring did Jackson let himself stop and think. 2 women, both nearly dead from exposure, lying on his cabin floor, both with deliberately cut hands and frostbitten fingers. Both found on a hunting tower in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by wolves. What in God's name had happened out there? He looked at Emma and Ruth, their faces pale in the firelight, and felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen for 3 years, locked away behind walls of grief and isolation. These women needed him, not in some abstract way, not as a neighbor doing his duty. They needed him right now, in this moment, or they would die. Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's compass. The brass was warm from his body heat. He looked at the engraving, "True North isn't on the map," and for the first time in 3 years, he thought he understood what his father had really meant. True North wasn't about being alone. It wasn't about protecting yourself from pain by cutting yourself off from everyone who might cause it. True North was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. He slipped the compass back into his pocket and got to work saving 2 women's lives. Jackson worked through the night with the focused intensity of a man fighting death itself. He'd seen hypothermia before, too many times in 40 years of Montana winters. He knew the signs, knew the dangers, knew how thin the line was between recovery and organ failure. First, he had to get their wet clothes off. He averted his eyes as much as possible, working with clinical efficiency to remove the frozen plaid blankets and the damp dresses beneath. He wrapped both women in dry blankets from his own bed, then in quilts Margaret had made years ago. The quilts still smelled faintly of lavender, and the scent brought a sharp pang of loss that he pushed away. No time for that now. He heated water on the stove. Not too hot, he knew better than that. Warm water, applied gradually. He soaked cloths and pressed them gently to their hands and feet, trying to restore circulation without causing more damage. The frostbite was bad, especially on their fingers. Some of those digits might not make it, but that was a worry for later. Right now, he just needed to keep them alive. Emma was his biggest concern. She hadn't woken up since he'd found her, hadn't responded to his voice or his touch. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak and thready. Jackson tilted her head back and managed to get a few spoonfuls of warm broth between her lips, but most of it just dribbled out. Ruth was better. She'd regained consciousness around midnight, her eyes opening to focus on the firelit ceiling above her. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice rough and cracked. "Don't try to talk," Jackson told her, bringing a cup of broth to her lips. "Just drink this." She managed a few swallows before turning her head away. "Emma? She's alive. That's all I can say right now." Ruth's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her weathered cheeks. "It's my fault. I talked her into it. I told her it would work." "Told her what would work?" Jackson kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "Ruth, I need to understand what happened out there. What were you 2 doing on that tower?" Ruth closed her eyes. For a moment Jackson thought she'd passed out again, but then she spoke, her words coming slow and painful. "The medicine wagon. Did you see it?" "What medicine wagon?" "From Billings. Dr. Williams ordered fever medicine 2 weeks ago. Half the children in town are sick, Mr. Miller. The Peterson boy already died. Little Sarah Henderson is barely hanging on. The wagon was supposed to arrive before the storm, but it got delayed." Jackson's chest tightened. He'd been so isolated up here, he hadn't even known about the outbreak. "Go on." "Thomas Crawford was driving it. He's young, maybe 25. Good boy, but not much experience with winter driving. Ruth paused to catch her breath. Emma and I were at the church yesterday morning when someone spotted his wagon coming down the North Pass. We could see the storm rolling in. Pastor Jenkins said Thomas should shelter at the church, wait out the blizzard. But Thomas said the children couldn't wait. He had to get the medicine through. "Fool, kid," Jackson muttered. "We all thought the same thing," Ruth said. "But Emma and we've both lost children, Mr. Miller. Different ways, different times, but we know what it's like to watch a child slip away and not be able to do anything about it. So when Thomas said he was going, we asked to ride along, thought maybe we could help keep the wagon steady, help with the horses, at least give him a better chance." Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You went out into that blizzard?" "We made it maybe 5 miles. The wind was so strong you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The horses were panicking, and Thomas was fighting to keep them on the road. Then we hit a drift that hid a washout. The whole wagon went over, dragged the horses with it, fell maybe 20 feet down into a ravine. My God!" Thomas got thrown clear, but he hit his head on a rock. He was bleeding bad, barely conscious. The horses were screaming. One had a broken leg, the other was tangled in the harness. "And the medicine, Mr. Miller? All those glass bottles, scattered in the snow." Ruth's voice broke. "We knew we had maybe an hour before we all froze to death. The wagon was ruined, no way to get it out. But the medicine, we could still save that." Jackson handed her more broth and waited while she drank. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the cabin's windows. Emma climbed down into the ravine. Ruth continued. Her hands were already going numb, but she packed as much medicine as she could into a canvas bag. We wrapped Thomas in every blanket we had, tried to stop the bleeding. Then Emma looked at the horses. The injured ones? The one with the broken leg was suffering. Emma. She used to help her husband with difficult decisions on their farm. She knew what had to be done. She took Thomas's pistol, and Ruth stopped, swallowed hard. The sound of that shot echoed forever in that ravine. Jackson understood immediately. The wolves heard it. We didn't hear them at first. The wind was too loud. But Emma, she knew. She said wolves would come for the dead horse, for the blood. And when they came, they'd find Thomas lying there helpless, and they'd find the medicine. She said we couldn't let that happen. "So you did what?" Jackson asked, though a terrible suspicion was already forming in his mind. Ruth raised her hands, the ones with the deliberate cuts across the palms. In the firelight, Jackson could see the wounds clearly now, clean slices, made with purpose. "We cut ourselves," Ruth said simply. "Emma had a knife. We made the cuts deep enough to bleed good, and then we walked, away from the ravine, away from Thomas and the medicine. We dragged our hands through the snow, left a blood trail that would draw any predator for miles." Jackson stared at her, stunned by the calculated brutality of it. "You made yourselves bait. Your hunting tower was the only shelter we knew of in this area." Emma remembered seeing it when she and her husband used to ride this country. "We thought if we could make it there, get up high, we might last long enough for the storm to pass. Long enough for someone to find Thomas and the medicine. You could have died up there. You nearly did die. Better than watching children die because we were too scared to take a risk." Ruth met his eyes, and Jackson saw no regret in them. Only a bone-deep exhaustion, and something else, a quiet pride. "We're old widows, Mr. Miller. Nobody depends on us anymore. But those children, they have their whole lives ahead of them." Seemed like a fair trade. Jackson sat back, his mind reeling. He'd known these women were brave, but this went beyond courage. This was the kind of sacrifice that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to give. "How long were you on the tower?" "Not sure. Time got strange after a while. The wolves came maybe an hour after we climbed up. They must have followed our trail. They circled and circled. We thought they'd leave eventually, but they didn't. Just kept waiting." Ruth's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Emma stopped talking sometime during the night. I tried to keep her awake, but she just drifted off. I thought she was dead. Thought we both would be. Jackson glanced at Emma, still unconscious by the fire. Her breathing seemed a little stronger now, her color a bit better. Maybe. Thomas, and the medicine, he said. They're still out there. If Thomas is still alive, he's in that ravine with maybe 2 blankets and a head wound. If the wolves find him before someone else does. Ruth didn't finish the sentence. Jackson stood up, his mind already working through what he needed to do. The storm had passed, but the temperature was dropping fast as night deepened. If Thomas Crawford was still alive, he wouldn't be for much longer. And the medicine, those children needed that medicine, but he had 2 women here who would die if he left them alone. Emma was still critical. Ruth was stable but weak. He couldn't leave them, but he couldn't abandon a man to freeze to death either. Where exactly did the wagon go over? He asked Ruth. North Pass, maybe 4 miles past your property line. There's a curve where the road bends around a big pine with a split trunk. The ravine is just beyond that, on the east side. Jackson knew the spot. It was rough country, hard to reach, even in good conditions. In this cold, with night falling, it would be treacherous. He looked at Ruth, then at Emma. He thought about his father's compass and what it meant to stay true when the world was spinning. He thought about Margaret and how she would have already been gathering supplies, getting ready to help, not wasting time on doubt. "I'm going after him," Jackson said. "You can't leave us," Ruth said, not pleading, just stating a fact. "I can't not go," Jackson replied, "but I'm going to make sure you 2 are as safe as possible first." He spent the next hour building up the fire until the cabin was almost too warm, banking coals that would last for hours. He made sure both women had water and broth within easy reach. He left his spare rifle loaded by the door, though he doubted either woman could hold it steady enough to fire. Before he left, Jackson knelt beside Ruth and pressed something into her good hand. "Keep this," he said. "It's always pointed true for my family. Figure it might do the same for you." Ruth's fingers closed around the brass, and fresh tears slipped down her face. "Thank you, Mr. Miller, for everything. Thank me when everyone's alive," Jackson said. He looked at Emma one more time, her face peaceful in the firelight, then headed for the door. He had a man to save and medicine to recover, and somewhere out there in the frozen darkness, a pack of wolves was still hunting. The moon was high by the time Jackson reached the North Pass, casting long shadows across the snow. Buck moved carefully beneath him, picking his way through drifts that sometimes came up to the horse's chest. Jackson had tied 2 extra coils of rope to his saddle, along with blankets, a lantern, and a flask of whiskey that might keep a man alive long enough to get him somewhere warm. The split pine Ruth had described stood stark against the night sky, its twin trunks reaching up like skeletal fingers. Jackson dismounted and tied Buck to a low branch, then walked carefully to the edge of the ravine. The drop was steep, maybe 30 feet down to a rocky bottom. In the moonlight, Jackson could make out the dark shape of the overturned wagon, one wheel still spinning slowly in the wind, and there, scattered in the snow around it, were the bodies of the 2 horses. One lay still, clearly dead. The other was the one Emma had shot, its blood dark on the snow. That blood would draw wolves like a dinner bell. "Thomas!" Jackson called down into the ravine. "Thomas Crawford, can you hear me?" Nothing, just the wind and the creak of the wagon. Jackson uncoiled his rope and tied it around the trunk of the split pine, testing it twice to make sure it would hold his weight. Then he lit his lantern and began the descent. The rope burned through his gloves as he lowered himself down the steep incline. His boots slipped on ice-covered rocks, and twice he nearly lost his grip entirely. But he made it to the bottom, landing in snow that came up to his knees. The wagon was worse up close. The whole front axle was shattered, and the canvas cover had torn away, leaving the contents exposed to the elements. Jackson moved toward it carefully, holding his lantern high. "Thomas," he called again. "It's Jackson Miller. I'm here to help." A sound barely more than a moan came from the far side of the wagon. Jackson hurried around and found him. Thomas Crawford was curled in a ball beneath what looked like a horse blanket, pressed up against the side of the wagon for whatever shelter it could provide. His face was covered in dried blood from a nasty gash above his right eye. His lips were blue, his skin waxy pale. But his eyes opened when Jackson knelt beside him, and that meant he was still alive. "Mr. Miller?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "Easy now. Don't try to move too fast." Jackson pulled his own coat off and wrapped it around the young man, then uncorked the whiskey flask. "Drink this, just a little." Thomas managed a few sips and coughed. "The medicine, the women, are they?" "The women are alive. Safe at my cabin. You did good getting them as far as you did. I failed. The wagon, the horses. You survived a 30-foot fall in a blizzard. That's not failure, son. That's a miracle." Jackson examined the head wound. It had stopped bleeding, which was good, but Thomas almost certainly had a concussion. "Can you stand?" "I think so." It took both of them working together to get Thomas to his feet. The young man swayed dangerously, and Jackson had to catch him before he fell. "This is going to be the hard part," Jackson said. "I need to get you up that rope. You think you can climb if I help from below?" Thomas looked up at the rope, then at the steep incline, and Jackson saw the moment reality hit him. "I don't think I can make it." "You're going to try, because if we stay down here much longer, we're both dead. You understand?" Thomas nodded weakly. Jackson positioned himself behind Thomas and got the rope into the young man's hands. "1 foot at a time. I'm right here. I won't let you fall." What followed was one of the most exhausting hours of Jackson's life. Thomas would climb a few feet, slip, and Jackson would have to support his entire weight while the young man found his footing again. Jackson's arms burned, his legs shook, and more than once he thought they'd both end up back at the bottom in a heap. But inch by painful inch, they made progress. And finally, Thomas's hand reached over the top of the ravine, and Buck snorted in recognition. Jackson practically pushed Thomas over the edge, then hauled himself up after. They both lay in the snow for a moment, gasping. "The medicine," Thomas said again. "We have to go back for it." Jackson had been thinking about that. The medicine was down there, scattered around the wreckage. Some bottles were probably broken, but others might be intact. The town needed that medicine. Children were dying, but it was nearly midnight. The temperature was well below zero. And he had a man here who was barely conscious, and 2 women at his cabin who still might not make it through the night. "I'm coming back at first light," Jackson decided. "Right now, I'm getting you somewhere warm." But no buts. Those women nearly died to give that medicine a chance. I'm not going to let their sacrifice mean nothing by getting us both killed, trying to retrieve it in the dark. Jackson got Thomas onto Buck. The young man was too weak to ride alone, so Jackson had to walk and lead the horse. The journey back to the cabin was slow and cold, and Jackson's legs felt like lead by the time his homestead came into view. Ruth was awake when they came through the door. She took one look at Thomas and started trying to get up. "Stay put," Jackson ordered, with more sharpness than he intended. "You're no use to anyone if you collapse." He got Thomas settled near the fire, wrapped in every remaining blanket. The young man's head wound needed attention, so Jackson cleaned it as best he could and wrapped it with strips torn from an old sheet. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling about the children, sometimes just staring at the fire. Emma was still unconscious, but her breathing had strengthened. When Jackson checked her pulse, it was steadier than before. He allowed himself a moment of hope. "You went back for him," Ruth said softly. "You left us alone and went back." "Couldn't leave him to freeze," Jackson said, stirring the pot of broth he'd had simmering. "Same as I couldn't leave you 2 on that tower. Most men would have chosen differently, would have stayed with the sure thing, instead of risking it all for a stranger." Jackson thought about that as he ladled broth into cups. Was Thomas a stranger? He'd never spoken to the young man before tonight, but he'd known Thomas's father had helped him build a barn once. And in a valley like Clearwater, nobody was really a stranger. You were all just neighbors you hadn't met yet. "My wife used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid," Jackson said. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. I was scared to death climbing down that ravine, scared I'd fall, scared I'd find him dead, scared I wouldn't be able to get him back up, but I was more scared of what I'd become if I didn't try. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Your wife was a wise woman. She was, Jackson agreed quietly. He fed Thomas what broth the young man could keep down, then checked on Emma again. Her eyes moved beneath her closed lids, and he took that as a good sign. Maybe she was dreaming. Maybe she was finding her way back. As Jackson settled into the chair by the fire, planning to stay awake and keep watch over his unexpected guests, he noticed something on the floor near Ruth. A small, leather-bound book, water-stained and worn. It must have fallen from Thomas's coat when Jackson had removed it. He picked it up and opened it. Inside, written in a neat hand, was a list of names, families, and next to each name, a notation of medicine ordered and paid for. The Peterson family, 2 bottles. The Henderson family, 1 bottle. The Morrison family, 3 bottles. Page after page of names, addresses, and carefully recorded orders. This was Dr. Williams's ledger. The record of every family waiting for medicine that might save their children's lives. Jackson counted the entries. 43 families, 43 households holding their breath, praying for a wagon to arrive with glass bottles full of hope. And that wagon was currently lying broken at the bottom of a ravine, surrounded by dead horses and fresh wolf tracks. Jackson looked at the 3 people sleeping fitfully around his fire. Emma and Ruth, who had sacrificed themselves as bait to protect this medicine. Thomas, who had risked the blizzard to deliver it. And somewhere in Clearwater Valley, 43 families were waiting, not knowing that help had come so close only to fail at the last moment. Unless Jackson could figure out how to succeed where the wagon had failed. He opened his father's compass. Ruth had set it on the table beside her and watched the needle swing to true north. The engraving seemed to catch the firelight. True north isn't on the map. His father had been right. True north wasn't a direction you could follow with a compass. It was a choice you made in your heart, over and over, even when the easy path was right there in front of you. Jackson closed the compass and made his choice. At first light, he was going back to that ravine. He was going to recover every bottle of medicine he could find. And then he was going to make sure it reached the families who needed it, even if he had to carry it to Clearwater 1 bottle at a time. The children were counting on him. Emma and Ruth had nearly died for them. And Jackson Miller, who had spent 3 years hiding from the world, was going to make sure their sacrifice meant something. He just had to figure out how to do it before any more children died waiting. Jackson dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake every time one of his patients made a sound. Around 3 in the morning, Emma finally stirred. Her eyes opened, unfocused and confused, scanning the unfamiliar ceiling. "Where?" Her voice came out as barely more than a croak. Jackson was at her side immediately with a cup of water. "Easy now. You're safe. You're at my cabin." Emma tried to sit up and gasped at the pain in her hands. Jackson helped her settle back down, propping her up with pillows. "Ruth?" Emma asked. "Right here," Ruth called from across the room. "Thanks to you, we're both alive." "Thomas? The medicine?" "Thomas is here too. Banged up but breathing. The medicine is still down in that ravine, but I'm going back for it at first light." Jackson watched Emma's face carefully. "Can you tell me what you remember?" Emma closed her eyes, and Jackson saw her working through the memories. The wagon going over, Thomas hitting his head, the horses screaming. "Ruth and we tried to think of what to do, but everything was happening so fast. Ruth told me about the blood trail, about leading the wolves away. It was the only thing we could think of." Emma's eyes opened again, and Jackson was struck by the clarity in them. No confusion now, no regret. Just a quiet certainty. Those children needed that medicine more than 2 old widows needed to stay comfortable. It seemed simple. Most people wouldn't call deliberately bleeding yourselves and becoming wolf bait simple. A ghost of a smile touched Emma's lips. Most people haven't lost a child, Mr. Miller. Once you have, the calculus changes. Nothing you face after that will ever be as hard. Everything else is just degrees of difficult. Jackson thought about Margaret, about the children they'd tried to have and couldn't, about the empty rooms in this cabin that had been meant for laughter and chaos, and the ordinary mess of family life. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe some losses recalibrated your understanding of fear itself. Your hands, he said gently, the frostbite is bad. You might lose some fingers. Better than losing my conscience. Ruth made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been pain. Jackson went to check on her and found her trying to work the wedding ring off her swollen finger. Leave that be, he said. You'll make it worse. I want you to have it, Ruth said. For payment. For all you've done. I don't want payment. Then take it as collateral. I can't pay you now, but I will. When spring comes and I can work again, I'll pay you back every cent this trouble cost you. Jackson looked at the simple gold band, worn thin from years of wear. It was probably the most valuable thing Ruth owned, and she was trying to give it away to a man who didn't need it. Ruth, I have a question for you, Jackson said, and I want an honest answer. When you and Emma decided to lead those wolves away, did you think you'd survive? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. No, she finally said. I didn't think we would, but I thought Thomas might, and I thought the medicine might. That seemed like enough. Then you didn't incur a debt. You can't owe someone for saving your life when you already gave it away. Jackson gently pushed her hand back down. Keep your ring. It's not mine to take. You're a stubborn man, Jackson Miller. So I've been told. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jackson prepared to return to the ravine. He packed rope, canvas bags, and an extra lantern. Buck had earned a rest, so Jackson saddled Pearl, his younger mare. She was less experienced in deep snow, but had better endurance for what might be a long, hard day. Thomas was awake now, though still weak. I should come with you, he said. You should stay here and keep these two ladies company, Jackson replied. I need someone to keep the fire going and make sure they drink enough broth. Can you do that? Thomas nodded, understanding that Jackson was giving him a job that mattered, a way to be useful despite his injuries. Before Jackson left, Emma called him over. Mr. Miller, there's something you should know. About the medicine. What about it? Some of those bottles are ether. Anesthetic for the doctor. It's clear liquid, looks just like water. But if the bottles broke, and it mixed with the other medicines, or got on your hands, she paused, it's dangerous, flammable, and if you breathe too much of it in that cold air, it could put you down hard. Jackson filed that information away. I'll be careful. Also, Emma continued, her voice dropping lower, when we were down there, right before we left, I saw something in the trees across from the ravine. Movement. Too big to be wolves. Bear? Wrong time of year for bears to be active, and the wrong kind of movement. It was, she struggled to find the words. It was watching. Deliberate, like it was waiting for something. A chill ran down Jackson's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Could have been a mountain lion. Could have been, Emma agreed, but her tone suggested she didn't believe that any more than he did. Jackson rode out as the sun broke over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and gold. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made every breath hurt. Pearl moved carefully through the drifts, and Jackson kept his rifle across his saddle, loaded and ready. When he reached the ravine, he found the rope still tied to the split pine where he'd left it, but something was different. The snow around the edge was disturbed, marked with tracks that hadn't been there the night before. Wolf tracks. A lot of them. Jackson dismounted and moved to the edge, looking down. The scene below made his blood run cold. The wolves had come back after he'd left. They'd torn into the dead horses with savage efficiency. Blood and gore were scattered across the snow, and what was left of the horses was barely recognizable. But that wasn't what made Jackson's hand tighten on his rifle. The wagon had been moved. Not much, just a few feet. But wagons didn't move themselves. especially not ones with broken axles sitting at the bottom of a ravine. And there, in the snow near what remained of the horses, were footprints, not wolf prints, not bear prints, human footprints. Barefoot human footprints, in snow that was well below freezing. Jackson stared at those prints for a long time, his mind working through possibilities and rejecting each one. No human could walk barefoot in this cold without losing their feet to frostbite within minutes. No human would be out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no supplies and no shelter. But those prints were there, clear as day, leading from the wagon into the trees on the far side of the ravine. The same trees Emma had seen something moving in. Jackson thought about the ghost pack and the stories people told about them. How they were smarter than normal wolves, more coordinated. How they seemed to know things they shouldn't know, appear in places they couldn't have reached. Some of the old-timers in Clearwater swore the pack was cursed, led by something that wasn't quite wolf and wasn't quite human. Jackson had always dismissed such talk as superstition, but standing here, looking at those impossible footprints, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. He shook his head, clearing away the dark thoughts. Speculation wouldn't save anyone. He needed to focus on what he could control, getting down there, finding the medicine, and getting back out before whatever had left those tracks decided to return. Jackson checked his rifle one more time, then started down the rope into the ravine. Behind him, unseen in the tree line, something watched and waited. The descent into the ravine felt different in daylight. Jackson could see everything now, the sharp rocks that could break bones, the patches of ice that could send him sliding into oblivion, the sheer drop that had somehow not killed Thomas Crawford outright. It was a miracle the young man had survived. Jackson's boots hit the bottom, and he immediately unholstered his rifle. The torn remains of the horses were worse in full light, and the blood had attracted more than just wolves. Crows and ravens circled overhead, their harsh calls echoing off the ravine walls. But it was still the footprints that drew his attention. In daylight, they were even more disturbing. He could see individual toes, the arch of a foot, heel impressions. Human, definitely human. But the stride was wrong, too long, too far apart. As if whatever had made them was moving faster than any person should be able to move. Jackson forced himself to look away and focus on the task at hand. The medicine was what mattered. He started with the wagon itself. The back section had held most of the cargo, and while the canvas cover was torn, it had provided some protection from the elements. Jackson pulled away broken boards and found a wooden crate wedged underneath an overturned barrel. The crate was labeled Dr. F. Williams, Clearwater, Montana Territory Medical Supplies, handle with care. The lid had cracked in the fall, but when Jackson pried it open, his heart lifted. Glass bottles, nestled in straw packing, many of them still intact. He counted quickly maybe 24 bottles of various sizes, labels written in a pharmacist's careful hand. Quinine sulfate, willow bark, extract, laudanum. And several labeled simply fever tonic, administer twice daily. Jackson carefully removed each intact bottle and set them in the canvas bag he'd brought. Some had leaked, their contents mixing with melted snow. Others were cracked, but still held most of their medicine. He took everything that seemed salvageable. As he worked, he found more supplies. Bandages, still dry in their wrapping. A bottle of carbolic acid for sterilization, needles and suture thread. All the tools a frontier doctor needed to fight illness and injury. And then he found something that stopped him cold. Tangled in the wagon's debris were the reins from the horses, thick leather straps, frozen stiff as boards. But these weren't just any reins. Jackson pulled them free and examined them closely in the morning light. The leather had been cut. Not torn in the accident, cut, clean slices through both reins, the kind of cuts that only a very sharp knife could make. Jackson's mind raced. If the reins had been cut before the accident, that meant the horses had been out of control before they ever reached the ravine. Thomas wouldn't have been able to steer, wouldn't have been able to stop. The wagon had been doomed from the moment someone had sabotaged it. But who would do such a thing, and why? A sound from above made Jackson spin, rifle coming up, but it was just a raven, landing on the edge of the ravine and regarding him with bright, intelligent eyes. Jackson forced himself to breathe. He was jumping at shadows. Maybe the reins had been damaged before the trip, weakened by years of use, and just happened to fail at the worst possible moment. Maybe he was seeing malice where there was only bad luck and poor maintenance. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. He continued searching the wreckage, finding a few more bottles of medicine in a second, smaller crate. This one had fared less well. Most of the bottles were broken, their contents soaked into the straw packing. But Jackson salvaged what he could. The ether bottles Emma had warned him about were easy to identify. They were made of dark amber glass and had red warning labels. 3 of them were intact. Jackson handled them very carefully, wrapping them in cloth and placing them in a separate bag. The last thing he needed was to knock himself unconscious with anesthetic fumes at the bottom of a ravine. As he worked, Jackson became aware of a growing sense of being watched. It was the same feeling he'd had sometimes while hunting, that prickle at the back of his neck that meant predator eyes were on him. He kept his rifle close and worked faster. He was reaching for the last visible bottle when he heard it sound like a footstep, but not quite, more like something heavy settling its weight onto a rock. The sound came from the far side of the ravine, near where those impossible footprints led into the trees. Jackson straightened slowly, rifle in hand, and looked across the ravine. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, he saw something in the shadows between the trees. A figure, tall and lean, standing perfectly still. It might have been human, might have been something else. The light was wrong, the distance too far, and the shadows too deep to tell for certain. Then it was gone, so quickly that Jackson couldn't say whether it had moved or if he'd just imagined it in the first place. His heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get out of this ravine, get back to the surface, get somewhere with clear sight lines and room to maneuver. Jackson grabbed his bags of medicine and supplies, slinging them over his shoulder. The rope was 20 feet away. He covered the distance in quick strides, trying not to run, trying not to show fear. Because predators could smell fear. And whatever was out here, human or animal or something in between, Jackson had a feeling it was very good at hunting things that ran. The climb up the rope was pure agony. The bags of medicine weighed him down, and his arms still ached from last night's exertions. Twice his boots slipped on icy rocks. Once the rope swung him hard against the ravine wall, and he had to bite back a curse as his shoulder struck stone. But he made it to the top, hauled himself over the edge, and immediately put his back to a tree with his rifle up and ready. Nothing came after him. The forest was still and silent except for the crows and ravens, now descending to feed on what remained of the horses. Jackson took a moment to catch his breath and assess what he'd recovered. 2 full bags of medicine, plus a smaller bag with the ether and other supplies. Not everything that had been in the wagon, but hopefully enough. Enough to save some of the children, at least. He secured the bags to Pearl's saddle, making sure they were balanced and wouldn't shift during the ride back. As he worked, his mind kept returning to those cut reins, those impossible footprints that shape in the shadows. Someone or something didn't want this medicine to reach Clearwater, and Jackson had a terrible feeling that whatever it wasn't done trying to stop them. The ride back to his cabin was uneventful, but Jackson couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on his back. He kept his rifle across his lap, loaded and ready. Pearl seemed nervous too, her ears constantly swiveling, her nostrils flaring as if testing the wind for predators. When the cabin finally came into view, relief washed over Jackson so strongly it made him dizzy. He'd done it. He'd recovered the medicine. Now all he had to do was figure out how to get it to the families who needed it before any more children died. But as he dismounted and began unloading the bags, he realized he had a more immediate problem. The front door of his cabin was standing open, and there was blood on the snow leading inside. Jackson's rifle came up as he approached the cabin, every sense on high alert. The blood trail was fresh, the droplets still bright red against the white snow. They led from the tree line on the east side, across the clearing, and straight through his open front door. "Thomas!" he called out. "Emma! Ruth!" No answer. Jackson moved to the side of the doorway, keeping his back to the wall. He could hear sounds from inside, now movement. Someone breathing hard. He took a breath, steadied himself, and swung around the doorframe with his rifle up. The scene that met his eyes made him lower the weapon immediately. Thomas was on the floor, bleeding from a reopened head wound. Ruth was trying to help him while keeping pressure on what looked like a gash on his arm. And Emma was standing by the window with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her face set in grim determination. "What happened?" Jackson asked, rushing to help Ruth with Thomas. "Wolves," Emma said, not taking her eyes off the window. "3 of them came right up to the cabin maybe 20 minutes after you left. One of them was huge, black as coal, with a white blaze on its face. The Alpha," Jackson thought. "The leader of the ghost pack. Thomas went out to bring in more firewood," Ruth explained, her hands shaking as she tried to tie a bandage around Thomas's arm. "We told him to take the rifle, but he didn't want to leave us defenseless. He had his coat half off when the wolves came around the corner of the cabin. One of them went straight for him." "I got the door shut," Thomas said weakly, "but not before it caught my arm, pulled me half out before Emma hit it with the poker." Jackson examined the wound. It was deep but clean. The wolf's teeth had torn through Thomas's coat and shirt and opened up a gash maybe 4 inches long. It was bleeding freely, but it didn't look like any major vessels had been hit. "You're lucky," Jackson said. "A few inches to the left and it would have gotten your artery." "Doesn't feel lucky," Thomas muttered. Jackson cleaned and bound the wound properly, then checked Thomas's head. The fall had reopened the cut from the wagon accident, but it wasn't serious. Just messy, the way head wounds always were. "The wolves," Jackson said to Emma. "They're still out there?" "They pulled back when I hit the one that grabbed Thomas, but they didn't leave." Jackson went to the window and looked out. Sure enough, he could see them, dark shapes moving between the pines, too patient, too deliberate. Wolves usually didn't behave this way. They were opportunistic hunters, not siege specialists. They'd test a barrier once, maybe twice, then move on to easier prey, unless they weren't just wolves. Jackson thought about the footprints in the ravine, the cut reins, the sense of being watched. He thought about the stories people told about the ghost pack, stories he'd always dismissed as superstition. "We need to talk," Jackson said, "all of us, about what's really going on here." He told them what he'd found in the ravine, the cut reins, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. Emma and Ruth exchanged glances, and Jackson could see they weren't surprised. "We saw something else," Emma said quietly. "While we were on the tower, waiting for the wolves to leave. There was a moment, maybe an hour before you found us, when the wind died down and the moon came out. The wolves all stopped howling at once, just went completely silent. And they all turned to look at the same spot in the trees, like they were waiting for orders." "Orders from what?" Jackson asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "From a man," Ruth said, "or something shaped like a man. It was too far away to see clearly, but it was walking upright, and the wolves were responding to it." Jackson felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Would you have believed us?" Emma asked. "Or would you have thought we were delirious from the cold?" She had a point. Even now, hearing it from both of them, part of Jackson's mind was rejecting what they were saying. Men didn't control wolf packs. Men didn't walk barefoot through sub-zero snow. Men didn't sabotage medicine wagons during fever outbreaks. But something did. "There's old stories," Ruth said. "My grandmother used to tell them. Stories about the first people who lived in this valley before the white settlers came. She said there were some among them who could wear the skins of animals, take on their forms and their strengths. They were called skinwalkers." "Witches," Emma added. Medicine men who'd turned to dark purposes. My husband's people had stories about them too. They said if you saw one, you were supposed to never speak its name, never look it in the eye, and never ever follow it into the woods. Jackson wanted to laugh, to dismiss it all as folklore and fear, but he kept thinking about those footprints, about the intelligence he'd seen in the alpha wolf's eyes when it had looked at him yesterday, about the way the wolves were behaving now, like soldiers waiting for orders rather than animals following instinct. Even if all that's true, Jackson said slowly, why would this thing, whatever it is, want to stop the medicine from reaching town? No one had an answer for that. Emma walked over to where her torn dress lay drying by the fire. She reached into a hidden pocket and pulled out a small silver locket on a chain. She opened it and showed Jackson what was inside. 2 photographs, faded and worn. One showed a young man in working clothes, strong and smiling. The other showed a group of children, maybe a dozen of them, standing in front of what looked like a schoolhouse. My husband, Emma said, pointing to the man. He died of fever 7 years ago. There was no medicine then either. Doctor had to order it from Billings, but it arrived too late. She touched the second photograph gently. These are the children I taught at the Clearwater School. 6 of them died that same winter. 6 children who might have lived if the medicine had come just a few days earlier. Jackson looked at the small faces in the photograph, frozen in time. Some of them were smiling, some were serious. All of them were gone now. After that, Emma continued, I started paying attention. Every winter, there's an outbreak. Every winter, Dr. Williams orders medicine from Billings. And every winter, something goes wrong. A wagon breaks down. A driver gets lost. A shipment gets delayed. She closed the locket carefully. At first, I thought it was just bad luck. Montana winters are hard, and the roads are rough. But it's been 7 years, Mr. Miller. 7 years of children dying while help fails to arrive at the last moment. You think someone's been sabotaging the medicine deliveries on purpose? Jackson said. I think something doesn't want Clearwater to thrive, doesn't want us to survive the winters, wants us weak, wants us desperate, wants us to eventually give up and leave. Why? Emma looked out the window at the wolves waiting in the trees. Maybe because something else wants this valley, something that was here long before we were, something that resents us for taking what it sees as its territory. Jackson's father's compass was still sitting on the table where Ruth had left it. Jackson picked it up and turned it over in his hands, looking at the familiar engraving. True north wasn't on the map. His father had meant that as a moral compass, a guide to doing the right thing. But maybe it meant something else too. Maybe true north was about seeing what was really there, not what you wanted to see, or what made sense according to everything you thought you knew about the world. And what was really here, in this valley, might be something much older and stranger than a simple wolf pack. So what do we do? Thomas asked. We can't just sit here waiting for those wolves or whatever's controlling them to decide to come back. Jackson looked at the bags of medicine he'd risked his life to recover, looked at the 3 people in his cabin who'd all nearly died trying to save children they barely knew, looked at Emma's locket with its photographs of the dead. We do what we came here to do, Jackson said. We get that medicine to Clearwater, to the families who need it. We do it fast, we do it smart, and we don't give that thing out there another chance to stop us. How? Ruth asked. The wolves have the cabin surrounded. Jackson smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. Then we'll have to go through them. Jackson spent the next hour preparing. He had 2 horses, 3 injured people, and maybe 40 pounds of medicine that needed to reach Clearwater before nightfall. The wolves or whatever was commanding them would try to stop him. That was certain. The only question was how. He was loading his rifle when Ruth called out to him, Mr. Miller, there's something you need to see. She was holding one of the medicine bottles he'd recovered from the ravine, but she wasn't looking at the medicine. She was looking at a piece of paper that had been wrapped around the bottle, sealed with wax. I found it when I was organizing the supplies, Ruth said. It's addressed to Dr. Williams. Jackson took the paper carefully. The seal had already been broken, probably by the impact when the wagon crashed. He unfolded it and began to read. The handwriting was neat and professional, the kind you'd expect from a pharmacist or doctor. "Dr. Williams," the letter began, "I am writing to warn you about the shipment you've requested. The fever outbreak in Clearwater is not what it appears to be. The symptoms you described in your order, high fever, delirium, seizures in children, these are not consistent with any natural illness. I have seen these symptoms before, 20 years ago, in a mining camp in the Colorado Territory. In that case, the outbreak was traced to deliberate poisoning of the town's water supply. Someone was putting small amounts of ergot fungus into the wells. The symptoms mimicked severe fever, but the cause was entirely man-made." Jackson's blood ran cold as he continued reading. "I strongly urge you to test Clearwater's water sources before administering the medicine I'm sending. If this is ergot poisoning, the fever tonic will help the symptoms but won't address the cause. The poisoning will continue until the source is found and eliminated. Furthermore, you should consider why someone would want to poison an entire town. In the Colorado case, it was a land scheme. Certain parties wanted to force the miners out so they could claim valuable mineral rights. I suspect something similar may be at work in your situation. Be cautious, Doctor, and trust no one until you know who benefits from Clearwater's suffering." The letter was signed by a Dr. Marcus Webb from Billings, dated 3 weeks earlier. Jackson read it twice, then handed it to Emma. She read it aloud so Ruth and Thomas could hear, her voice growing quieter with each sentence. When she finished, the cabin was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. "Poisoned," Thomas finally said. "Someone's been poisoning the whole town." "But who?" Ruth asked. "Who would do such a thing?" Jackson's mind was racing through possibilities. A land scheme made sense. Clearwater Valley was valuable territory, with good grazing land, timber, and access to water. If someone wanted to drive out the current settlers and claim the land for themselves, slowly poisoning the population would be an effective, if monstrous, way to do it. "We need to think about who has access to the town's wells," Jackson said. "Who could be adding poison without being noticed?" "The wells are in the town square," Emma said. "Anyone could reach them at night. But ergot fungus, that's not something you just find lying around. You'd have to cultivate it, harvest it, process it. That takes knowledge and time. My husband told me about ergot once," Ruth said slowly. "It grows on rye and other grains. He said the old millers used to watch for it because it could ruin an entire harvest, turn the grain black and make it poisonous. But he also said," she paused, thinking, "he said it grows best in damp conditions, near water." "There's only one person in Clearwater who grows rye on a large scale," Thomas said, "and his farm is right on the creek, upstream from the town wells." "Who?" Jackson demanded. "Samuel Crenshaw. He owns about 500 acres just north of town. Came to the valley maybe 8 years ago. Bought out the Henderson place when old Tom's brother died. He keeps to himself mostly, but he's always been." Thomas struggled to find the words. "There's something off about him, the way he watches people, the way he talks to himself when he thinks no one's listening." Jackson felt pieces clicking into place. "Does he have family in town? People who'd be affected by the poisoning?" "No, he's a bachelor. Lives alone in that big farmhouse. No close friends that I know of. And he'd profit if people left Clearwater. He'd be able to buy up their land for nothing," Emma said. "Once enough families left or died, he could claim the whole valley." It was monstrous, but it made terrible sense, and it explained why the medicine shipments kept failing to arrive. Crenshaw couldn't allow the town to recover, couldn't let them figure out what was really making them sick. He needed them weak, desperate, dying. But it didn't explain everything. "The wolves," Jackson said. "The thing controlling them. How does Crenshaw fit with that?" "Maybe he doesn't," Ruth said quietly. "Maybe there are two separate things happening here. The poisoning is Crenshaw, but the wolves, the skinwalker, maybe that's something else, something older, Or maybe they're working together, Emma suggested. You said your grandmother's stories spoke of medicine men who turned to dark purposes. What if Crenshaw learned those old ways? What if he's using them to protect his scheme? Jackson thought about the footprints in the ravine, the intelligence in the alpha wolf's eyes. He thought about the stories Ruth's grandmother had told, stories from the people who'd lived in this valley long before any white settlers arrived. It doesn't matter, he said finally. Whether it's one threat or two, whether it's Crenshaw alone or Crenshaw with dark magic, the answer's the same. We get this medicine to town. We warn Dr. Williams about the poisoning. We stop Crenshaw before he kills anyone else. The wolves are still out there, Thomas reminded him. I know. Jackson checked his rifle, then checked the spare. That's why we're not all going. Thomas, you're in no shape to ride. You'll stay here with Ruth. Keep the fire going, keep the doors barred. If anything tries to get in, shoot it. And us? Emma asked. You and I are riding to Clearwater. We'll take both horses, split the medicine between them in case something happens to one. We ride fast, we ride smart, and we don't stop for anything. The wolves will follow us, Emma said. It wasn't a question. I'm counting on it. Better they follow us than lay siege to this cabin. At least on horseback, we have a fighting chance. Jackson began dividing the medicine into 2 saddlebags, balancing the weight carefully. He made sure Emma had warm clothes, gloves that would let her hold the reins despite her injured hands. He gave her his spare pistol and showed her how to fire it from horseback. Aim low, brace for the recoil. Don't try to be accurate, just be loud and scary. As they prepared to leave, Jackson found himself thinking about his father's compass, about true north and what it really meant. His father had lived his whole life in this valley. Had he known about the poisoning? About Crenshaw? About the things in the woods that weren't quite wolf and weren't quite human? Or had he simply done what Jackson was doing now, seen a problem, seen people in need, and decided that the right thing to do was help, regardless of the cost? Mr. Miller, Emma said, interrupting his thoughts. There's one more thing you should know. She pulled out her locket again, the one with her husband's photograph and the pictures of the dead children. But this time, she opened a hidden compartment in the back that Jackson hadn't noticed before. Inside was another photograph, smaller, more faded. It showed a young woman, maybe 20 years old, standing beside an older couple. Jackson recognized the cabin in the background immediately. It was his cabin, and the older couple was his parents. That's my mother, Emma said softly. Your father and mother took her in when her own parents died in a barn fire. She lived with them for 2 years before she married and moved away. Your father gave her away at her wedding, Emma's voice caught. He was like a father to her when she had no one else, which means, Mr. Miller, that in a way, you and I are family. Jackson stared at the photograph, at the young woman who must have been Emma's mother, standing on the porch of his cabin with his parents smiling beside her. His father's hand was on her shoulder, protective and kind. The same way Jackson had touched Emma's shoulder yesterday when he'd found her on the tower, half frozen and close to death. Why are you telling me this now? Jackson asked. Because I need you to understand, Emma said. This isn't just about saving strangers. Your father saved my mother. And now, all these years later, I have a chance to help save this valley, the same valley he loved and protected his whole life. I'm not going to waste that chance. And I don't think you will either. Jackson closed his hand around the compass in his pocket. True north. His father had always known where it was. And now, looking at Emma's determined face, at the medicine that could save children's lives, at the path ahead that would surely bring them face to face with wolves and worse, now Jackson knew where it was too. Let's ride, he said. They left the cabin at noon, when the sun was highest and the shadows shortest. Jackson on Buck, Emma on Pearl. Both horses carried medicine, divided equally in case one horse went down. Both riders carried rifles and pistols, loaded and ready. The wolves appeared within 5 minutes. They came from the trees on the north side, melting out of the shadows like smoke. Jackson counted 7 of them, including the massive black alpha with the white blaze. They moved in formation, too coordinated to be natural, pacing the horses as they rode. "Don't look at them," Jackson told Emma. "Don't make eye contact, just keep riding." They followed the trail toward Clearwater, but Jackson deliberately took a longer route, one that would keep them in open country as much as possible. The wolves stayed with them, matching their pace exactly, never attacking, never falling behind, just watching, waiting. "Why aren't they attacking?" Emma asked, after they'd been riding for 20 minutes. "Because they're not hunting us," Jackson said. "They're herding us, pushing us where they want us to go." He was proven right 10 minutes later when they reached what should have been a passable creek crossing. The ice that had been solid enough to cross for weeks had suddenly given way, leaving dark water flowing fast and dangerous. The wolves had somehow known it would be impassable and had been guiding them toward it. Jackson turned buck north, looking for another crossing. The wolves shifted with them, still maintaining that perfect distance, still watching with those 2 intelligent eyes. "We're running out of time," Emma said. "If we can't cross here, we'll find another way." But Jackson's confidence was wearing thin. Every route he tried seemed blocked by drifts too deep to cross, ice too thin to trust, or terrain too rough for the horses. And all the while, the wolves kept pace, patient and relentless. They'd been riding for nearly 2 hours when they reached the old timber camp. It had been abandoned for years, the buildings slowly collapsing under the weight of countless winters. But the main lodge was still standing, and Jackson made a decision. "We're going to rest the horses," he said. They dismounted near the lodge, and Jackson led both horses to a small stream that ran behind the building. The wolves circled the camp, but didn't approach. Jackson counted them again, still 7. The alpha sat on a small rise, maybe 100 yards away, watching. Inside the lodge, Jackson found an old map tacked to the wall, left behind by the loggers. It showed the valley and the surrounding territory in detail, including trails he'd forgotten existed. He studied it carefully, looking for routes the wolves couldn't predict or block. Emma stood by the window, keeping watch. "They're just sitting there, waiting. They know we have to keep moving. They can afford to be patient." Jackson traced a path on the map with his finger. "There's an old mining road here, runs along the ridge. It's steep and rough, but it should be clear. If we can reach it, we can bypass most of the obvious crossings. And if the wolves block that too, then we find another way. We keep finding other ways until we run out of options or we reach Clearwater. Those are the only 2 choices." Emma turned from the window, and Jackson saw the exhaustion in her face. Her hands were shaking from holding the reins despite the frostbite pain. Her lips were pressed thin against the cold, but her eyes were steady, determined. "Your father," she said. "Your mother. They never gave up on my mother when things got hard. Even when it would have been easier to send her away, they kept her, protected her, gave her a chance at life. I won't dishonor their memory by giving up now." Jackson felt something shift in his chest. For 3 years he'd been locked in grief, frozen in place like his nickname suggested. He'd told himself he was honoring Margaret's memory by preserving everything exactly as it had been, by not moving forward, by not letting anyone new into his life. But that wasn't honor. That was fear. Fear of losing someone else, fear of caring again, fear of the pain that came with connection. Margaret would have hated what he'd become. She'd always been about forward motion, about embracing life even when it was hard. She'd wanted children, had mourned each miscarriage, but never let the grief stop her from trying again. She'd lost her own mother young, but had reached out to help other women, including Emma and Ruth, even though Jackson hadn't known about it at the time. Margaret had known where true north was, and it wasn't in the past, frozen and unchanging. It was in the present moment, in the choice to help even when it was hard, to connect even when it hurt, to move forward even when you were scared. Jackson reached into his coat and pulled out something he'd carried with him since Margaret died. Her red wool scarf, the one she'd worn on cold days when she'd ride out to check on distant neighbors. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, of wood smoke and lavender. He'd meant to bury it with her, but couldn't bring himself to let it go, so he'd kept it close, a talisman against the grief that threatened to swallow him whole. "We'll use this," he said, holding up the scarf, "as a signal marker. When we get close to Clearwater, we'll tie it to a tree where people can see it. Let them know we're coming with the medicine. Let them be ready to help." Emma looked at the scarf, understanding its significance. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." And as Jackson said it, he realized it was true. Keeping the scarf, keeping his grief, keeping himself frozen and apart, none of that had honored Margaret's memory. But this, using something of hers to help save lives, to bring hope to a town that was dying, this was what she would have wanted. They rested for 20 minutes, letting the horses drink and catch their breath. Jackson divided some jerky between them, and they ate quickly, mechanically. Food was fuel now, nothing more. As they prepared to leave, Jackson noticed something odd. One of the wolves, a grey female, smaller than the others, had separated from the pack. She was sitting alone, maybe 50 yards from the lodge, looking at them with an expression that seemed almost conflicted. "That one's different," Emma said, noticing his attention. "She's been hanging back since we left your cabin." Jackson studied the wolf carefully. She wasn't as coordinated with the pack as the others. Sometimes she'd move when they stopped, or stop when they moved, as if she was fighting the control that bound the others. "Maybe not all of them are fully under the skinwalker's influence," Emma suggested. "Maybe some of them are fighting it." It was a slim hope, but Jackson filed it away. Any weakness in the enemy's forces was worth noting. They mounted up and headed out, taking the mining road Jackson had found on the map. It was steep and treacherous, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses in places where the trail narrowed to barely more than a footpath. The wolves followed, but with more difficulty. The terrain was harder for them, and they had to spread out more to navigate the rocks and steep grades. For the first time since leaving the cabin, Jackson felt like they were gaining an advantage. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when they finally cleared the ridge and saw Clearwater Valley spread out below them. The town looked small and vulnerable from this height, a collection of buildings huddled around the frozen creek. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and tentative. Jackson could just make out people moving between buildings, tiny figures going about their evening chores. Somewhere down there, children were sick. Families were mourning. Dr. Williams was doing everything he could with inadequate supplies, and no idea that the illness he was fighting wasn't natural at all. And Samuel Crenshaw was watching it happen, probably pleased with how well his plan was working. "We're close," Emma said. "Maybe 2 more hours if we push hard." "We push hard," Jackson agreed. "No more stops." They started down the far side of the ridge, and that's when everything went wrong. The alpha wolf, which had been hanging back with the pack, suddenly let out a howl that raised every hair on Jackson's neck. It wasn't a normal wolf howl. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like a human voice trying to speak words through an animal throat. And every wolf on the ridge stopped moving and turned to face them. "Jackson," Emma's voice was tight with fear. "I see them." The wolves were closing in now, all pretense of patience abandoned. They moved with purpose, with coordination, converging from multiple angles to cut off any escape route. The grey female was there too, but she was moving more slowly, as if still fighting the compulsion that drove the others. "We can't outrun them downhill," Jackson said, his mind racing through options. "The horses will slip, break their legs. We'd be on foot in minutes. So, what do we do?" Jackson looked at the approaching wolves, at the town in the distance, at the medicine they'd risked everything to recover. He thought about his father's compass, about true north, about the choice his father had made every single day to help, to protect, to stand firm, even when standing was hard. "We stand our ground," he said, "right here, right now. We make them fight for it, and we don't let them through." He pulled Margaret's red scarf from his coat and tied it to a tall pine beside the trail, letting it flutter in the wind like a battle standard, a signal to the town below that help was coming, a promise that they hadn't given up, a declaration that some things were worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. The wolves circled closer, and Jackson chambered around in his rifle. "Emma," he said, "when this starts, you ride. Take Pearl and the medicine, and you ride as fast as you can for town. Don't look back, don't stop, don't wait for me. I'm not leaving you. You have to. The medicine has to get through. That's what matters. That's what all of this has been for. Your father didn't abandon my mother when things got hard," Emma said, "and I'm not abandoning you." The alpha wolf stepped forward, and for just a moment Jackson could swear he saw something else, a shadow behind the animal or within it. Something tall and lean and ancient, wearing the wolf's form like a coat. The skinwalker, the thing that had been poisoning this valley for years, working with or through Samuel Crenshaw to drive people away, to claim territory that had been taken from it long ago. Jackson raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel at the alpha, and made his choice. "Then we fight together," he said, "and we don't stop fighting until we win or we're dead." The wolf charged, and the battle began. Jackson's first shot took the alpha in the shoulder, spinning the massive wolf sideways, but it didn't go down. Instead, it snarled and kept coming, blood staining the snow behind it. The other wolves attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, 3 from the left, 2 from the right, 1 straight ahead. Buck reared, screaming. Jackson fought to control him while trying to chamber another round. Emma fired her pistol, the crack sharp in the cold air. One of the wolves yelped and fell back, but another lunged for Pearl's throat. Pearl dodged with surprising agility, her hooves catching the wolf across the skull with a sickening crunch. The animal went down hard and didn't get up. Jackson got Buck under control and fired again, catching another wolf mid-leap. The bullet took it through the chest, and it crumpled into the snow. But there were still 5 of them, and they weren't backing down. The alpha circled, blood dripping from its shoulder wound. Up close, Jackson could see something he'd missed before: a collar around the wolf's neck. Not a normal collar. This one was made of braided sinew and bone, with strange markings carved into the pieces. It looked ancient, like something that had been worn for decades or longer. "The collar!" Emma shouted. "There's something wrong with the collar." She was right. The other wolves didn't have collars, but they were all looking at the alpha, taking their cues from it, as if the alpha was the conduit through which the skinwalker controlled the entire pack. Jackson aimed for the collar. If he could break it, maybe he could break the control. He fired. The shot was perfect, catching the braided sinew dead center. The collar exploded in a spray of bone fragments and torn leather. The alpha wolf's eyes, which had been glowing with an unnatural intelligence, suddenly went blank. It stumbled, shook its head as if waking from a dream, and then did something Jackson didn't expect. It ran. Not attacking, not circling, just ran, disappearing into the forest with a speed born of pure terror. The other wolves hesitated, confused. The grey female who'd been hanging back whimpered and lowered her head. 2 of the remaining wolves backed away, their body language changing from aggressive to uncertain. But 2 others, the biggest males after the alpha, didn't break. They kept advancing, snarling, foam flecking their jaws. Jackson realized with a chill that these 2 had been with the pack longer, had been under the skinwalker's influence for so long that they couldn't break free even when the conduit was destroyed. One of them lunged for Jackson. He tried to bring his rifle around, but the wolf was too fast. It hit him full in the chest, driving him backward off Buck. Jackson hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, the wolf's teeth snapping inches from his face. He got his forearm up just in time, blocking the bite. The wolf's jaws clamped down on his heavy coat sleeve, tearing through fabric and finding flesh beneath. Pain exploded up Jackson's arm, but he used the wolf's grip against it, yanking it off balance. Emma was there suddenly, swinging a heavy branch she'd grabbed from the ground. She hit the wolf across the spine with everything she had, and it yelped and released Jackson's arm. He rolled away and grabbed his pistol from where it had fallen in the snow. The wolf turned toward Emma, and Jackson fired twice. Both shots hit center mass. The wolf dropped and didn't move. The last aggressive wolf was circling Pearl, trying to find an opening. But Pearl was having none of it. She kicked out with her back legs, and when the wolf dodged, she wheeled and came at it with her front hooves, striking like a boxer. The wolf tried to retreat, but Buck had come around behind it, cutting off its escape. Trapped between two angry horses, the wolf made a desperate lunge at Buck. Buck sidestepped with practiced ease, and Pearl's hooves came down on the wolf's back, breaking its spine. The animal collapsed, twitching, and then lay still. Silence fell over the ridge, broken only by heavy breathing from horses and humans alike. The grey female and the two younger wolves that had backed away were watching from a safe distance, no longer aggressive. They looked like what they really were now, just animals, scared and confused, no longer bound to an unnatural purpose. Jackson got slowly to his feet, his arm throbbing where the wolf had bitten through. Emma was at his side immediately, examining the wound. "It's bad," she said. "You're bleeding. It can wait. We have to move while we have the chance." He walked over to where the alpha wolf's collar had fallen. The braided sinew was torn and blackened, as if it had been burned from the inside. The bone fragments had strange symbols carved into them, symbols Jackson didn't recognize, but that made his skin crawl to look at. This was old magic, dark magic. The kind that shouldn't exist but did, passed down through generations of those who knew how to twist nature to their will. Jackson kicked snow over the remains of the collar, covering it. Some things were better left buried. "We need to go," Emma said. "If that thing controlled the alpha, it knows we broke the collar. It knows we're still coming." She was right. The skinwalker, whether it was Crenshaw or something else, something older, would know what had happened here, and it wouldn't be pleased. They mounted up again, both horses skittish but responding to their riders. Jackson's arm was bleeding steadily, but Emma had torn a strip from her skirt and bound it tight. It would hold until they reached town. The grey female wolf and her two companions watched them ride away. They didn't follow. And when Jackson looked back one last time before they descended into the valley, he saw them turning and heading in the opposite direction, back toward the high country where wolves belonged. Free at last. They rode hard down the ridge, the town growing larger with each minute. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the snow in shades of orange and red. Jackson's arm throbbed in time with Buck's hoofbeats, but he pushed the pain aside. They were close, so close. As they reached the valley floor and the first outlying farms, people began to notice them. A woman hanging laundry stopped and pointed. A man chopping wood set down his axe and stared. Word spread faster than they could ride, and by the time they reached the main street of Clearwater, a crowd had gathered. "That's Miller," someone shouted. "Jackson Miller from up north. Is that Emma Hartley with him? They've got something on the horses, looks like cargo." Dr. Williams pushed through the crowd, a tall man with iron-grey hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. His sleeves were rolled up despite the cold, and he looked exhausted, like a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. "Jackson," he said. "Emma, what in God's name?" "The medicine from Billings," Jackson said, dismounting carefully to avoid jarring his injured arm. "We recovered it from the wagon that crashed during the storm." A murmur went through the crowd. Hope, disbelief, and desperate longing all mixed together. "Thomas Crawford?" the doctor asked. "Alive. At my cabin with Ruth Brennan, both injured but stable. And the medicine, is it intact?" "Most of it." Emma was already untying the saddlebags. "We have the fever tonic, the quinine, and various other supplies. But, Doctor, there's something else you need to know." She pulled out the letter from Dr. Webb and handed it to Williams. The doctor read it quickly, his face going pale. "Ergot poisoning," he whispered. "Dear God, that would explain why the symptoms kept recurring even in families that seemed to recover. I thought it was reinfection, but if the water supply itself is contaminated—" "There's more," Jackson said. He told the doctor about Samuel Crenshaw, about the rye farm upstream from the town wells, about the pattern of medicine shipments that had failed to arrive year after year. As Jackson spoke, he watched the crowd's reaction. Most people looked shocked, horrified, but a few looked skeptical, and one man in particular, Jackson, recognized him as Henry Barnes, one of Crenshaw's few friends in town, looked angry. "That's quite an accusation," Barnes said loudly. "Sam Crenshaw is a respected landowner. You're saying he's been poisoning children?" "I'm saying someone has," Jackson replied, "and the evidence points to him. His farm is the only one in a position to contaminate the wells, and he's the only one who profits if this town dies and people abandon their land." "Where is Crenshaw?" Dr. Williams asked. "Haven't seen him in 2 days," someone called out. "His farm's been dark." "I'll go," Jackson said. "But first, we need to distribute this medicine to the families that need it. And doctor, you need to test the water supply. If it's contaminated, we have to warn everyone immediately." The doctor nodded and turned to his assistant, a young man named Peter. "Get the medicine into the clinic, organize it by family, based on the ledger. We start distributing within the hour." He looked at Jackson's bleeding arm. "And you need that bite treated before you go anywhere." "It can wait." "No, it can't. Wolf bites go septic if they're not cleaned properly. You'll be no use to anyone if you die of blood poisoning." The doctor's tone left no room for argument. While Dr. Williams cleaned and stitched Jackson's arm, Emma organized the medicine distribution with Peter's help. Jackson watched through the clinic window as people lined up, mothers holding sick children, fathers with worried faces, elderly folk who'd been nursing grandchildren through the fever. And as each family received their bottles of medicine, Jackson saw hope kindle in their eyes. Not just hope that the medicine would work, but hope that someone had cared enough to fight for them, that they weren't forgotten or abandoned. "This is what you want to tell them," Dr. Williams said quietly as he tied off the last stitch. "That they matter, that their lives are worth fighting for." "That's what Emma and Ruth told me," Jackson said, "when they explained why they'd made themselves bait for wolves. They're remarkable women. They've been trying to get the town to investigate the water supply for months, but most people thought they were just grieving widows, seeing patterns where there weren't any." The doctor finished bandaging Jackson's arm. "Turns out, sometimes the people on the margins see things more clearly than those of us in the center." Jackson stood, testing his arm. "It hurt, but it would hold. I'm going to Crenshaw's farm." "You can't go alone." "I won't." Jackson looked out the window and saw a group of men gathering, ranchers and farmers who'd lost children or nearly lost them, men with hard faces and harder hands. "I think I'll have company." Henry Barnes was still standing in the street, looking uncertain now. Jackson walked up to him. "You know where Crenshaw is?" Jackson asked. Barnes hesitated, then nodded. "I saw smoke from his chimney this morning. He's home." "Then show us the way." Barnes looked at the men gathering behind Jackson, at the medicine bottles being distributed to grateful families, at the truth that was becoming impossible to deny. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, "I'll take you. But if Sam's innocent, then he has nothing to fear," Jackson finished. "But if he's guilty, he answers for what he's done." They rode out as the sun set behind the mountains, a group of 12 men on a mission that felt as old as justice itself. Samuel Crenshaw's farmhouse sat dark against the twilight sky, smoke rising from its chimney like a signal of habitation. But as the men approached, Jackson felt wrongness in the air, a tension that made Buck dance nervously beneath him. They found Crenshaw in his barn, surrounded by sacks of rye. Some of the grain was blackened with ergot fungus, carefully separated and stored in sealed containers. The evidence of his guilt was everywhere: grinding stones coated with dark powder, measuring spoons, a ledger documenting when he'd added poison to the town wells and in what quantities. But they didn't find him alive. Crenshaw was slumped against the wall, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror. There were no marks on him, no signs of violence. but his eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. "What killed him?" one of the men asked, his voice shaking. Jackson knelt beside the body, checking for any obvious cause of death. Nothing. No wounds, no poison that he could detect. But when he looked at Crenshaw's hands, he saw what looked like claw marks, not deep enough to be fatal, but enough to draw blood. And in the dust on the barn floor, leading away from the body, were those same impossible footprints, barefoot, too large, too far apart. "The skinwalker," Henry Barnes whispered. "Sam made a deal with it, let it use his land, his position in town, in exchange for power. But when we broke the wolf collar, when the plan failed, it came for payment," Jackson finished, "and took what it was owed." They found more in Crenshaw's house, letters written in a language none of them could read, drawings of the wolf pack with the alpha circled and marked with the same symbols that had been on the collar, and a map showing every farm in Clearwater Valley, with most of them marked for acquisition after their owners voluntarily left or died. Crenshaw had planned to own the entire valley within 5 years, and he'd been well on his way to succeeding. They took the evidence back to town, along with samples of the contaminated rye. Dr. Williams arranged for the wells to be drained and cleaned, and warned everyone to boil water until the testing was complete. Within days, the fever cases began to decline. Within 2 weeks, they stopped entirely. The children recovered. Little Sarah Henderson, who'd been near death, was running around again within a month. The Peterson family welcomed a new baby to replace the son they'd lost. Life returned to Clearwater like spring after a hard winter. Jackson stayed in town longer than he'd planned, helping coordinate the well cleaning and visiting families to make sure they understood the importance of watching for contamination. But more than that, he found himself simply present at church services, town meetings, barn raisings, being part of the community in a way he hadn't been since Margaret died. Emma and Ruth recovered slowly from their ordeal. Ruth lost 2 fingers to frostbite, but she bore it with grace, saying she had 8 left, and that was more than enough for any useful work. Emma's hands healed better, though the scars would always remind her of the night she'd made herself bait for wolves. Thomas Crawford became something of a hero in town, though he insisted he'd just been doing his job. He started courting the minister's daughter, and people said they'd be married by summer. One evening in early spring, as Jackson was preparing to head back to his cabin, Emma found him at the livery stable. "The town wants to give you something," she said, "as thanks for everything you did." "I don't need thanks." "I know, but we need to give it, please." The entire town had gathered in the square. Jackson felt uncomfortable with so many eyes on him, but he stood there as Dr. Williams stepped forward with a small wooden box. "Jackson Miller," the doctor said, "you came down from your mountain when we needed you most. You risked your life to save people you barely knew. You showed us what it means to be true to your principles, even when it costs you everything." He opened the box. Inside was a brass compass, new and shining, with an engraving on the back, "True North is community." "Your father's compass saved my mother," Emma said, stepping forward, "and his son saved all of us. We wanted you to have this to remember that True North isn't just about individual moral courage. It's about the connections between us, the community we build, the people we choose to stand with when times get hard." Jackson took the compass, his throat tight. He opened it and watched the needle swing, finding its direction just as surely as his father's old compass had always done. "Thank you," he managed to say, "all of you." That night, as he rode back to his cabin with Emma and Ruth, who had nowhere else to go and had accepted his offer to stay until spring, Jackson thought about True North and what it really meant. His father had been right that it wasn't on any map. But Emma and the town had been right too, that it wasn't just about individual moral strength. True North was the intersection of principle and community, of courage and connection. It was about knowing who you were and what you stood for, but also about recognizing that you weren't meant to stand alone. Margaret had known that. She'd reached out to help people, built connections, created community, and in dying, she'd inadvertently pushed Jackson away from all of that into isolation and grief. But now, riding through the spring twilight with two widows who'd become friends, carrying medicine that had saved children's lives, bearing a compass that reminded him he was part of something larger than himself, now Jackson understood. True North wasn't about perfection or never being afraid. It was about choosing to help when help was needed, choosing to stand when standing was hard, choosing to be part of the world even when the world could hurt you. As they reached the cabin, Jackson saw that Ruth and Emma had planted something while he'd been in town. Small green shoots were coming up near the porch, vegetables and flowers, the beginning of a garden. Margaret's garden had died when she did, but here was a new garden, planted by new friends, promising growth and life and connection. Jackson touched the compass in his pocket, feeling its weight. Then he smiled and went inside to start dinner for 3. True North, he'd finally learned, was simply this: showing up, helping out, and never giving up on the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. And that was enough.